This brain and your brain is built for a world where we need each other to survive. When we fail to find connection and we allow ourselves to become isolated, our health actually suffers. There are systems in our brain that make us feel good when we're around each other. Being around others triggers the same brain activity as ecstasy. Says a lot about why we are wired to be social. All these psychedelic drugs have a really unique property in that they trigger these life-altering experiences. And that experience seems to be really important for the therapeutic effect, specifically when paired with psychotherapy. Like, let's be clear, MDMA is not a drug you want to be taking every day. All these psychedelic drugs have a really unique property. There's bad things that can happen when you take Molly.
Welcome back, everyone, to Diary of an Empath podcast. Today's guest is someone whose work might just change the way that you think about yourself and about every relationship in your life. Dr. Ben Rein is a neuroscientist who has spent over a decade in research labs studying one of the most fundamental questions of human existence. Why do our brains need other people? He's the author of the upcoming book, Why Brains Need Friends, which explores what happens inside the brain when we connect, when we feel empathy, when we fall in love, and what happens when we're alone. So in this conversation, we'll uncover why our brains are wired to be social, how loneliness reshapes the brain, the neuroscience behind love and empathy, and even how digital connection like Zoom, social media compares being in the same room rather than with someone else online. But this isn't just about the science. It's about the choices we make every day in our friendships, our families, our relationships, and our lives. So Dr. Rein, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That was a lovely intro. I really genuinely appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I'm excited because your work is very interesting. And I think it comes at a time when we are really looking in real time to see how social connections and changes are impacting us in very different ways than, I don't know how old you are, but as a millennial, we grew up in a time where we didn't have technology, and now all of a sudden we're kind of thrown into it ourselves. I'm curious for you, why did you first become fascinated with the brain and social behavior?
Yeah, I don't know why, truthfully. I am this way, but I've always been this way, I guess. I remember when I was a kid, when I was like in elementary school, before I even knew neuroscience was a thing or a field, I remember looking around my cafeteria and seeing, I could still picture my elementary school cafeteria and the tables and the way that my classmates were arranged is what interested me. I thought it was neat that at certain tables, we had really outgoing, sociable students all kind of grouped together, having fun, laughing, talking really loudly. They were the energy of the cafeteria. Then a couple tables over, you had really quiet, introverted kids all sitting together, but not really interacting. They were on their phone, or they didn't have phones, I'm sorry. They were on their, looking at like a book or a lunch or something. Nowadays, I'm sure they are on their phones, this same type of table of students. And I just thought that was interesting. I thought it was, because I was trying to figure myself out at the time. And I thought, where do I stand? Am I over there with the noisy, rambunctious kids, or am I over here with the quiet, reserved kids? And turns out I'm extroverted. So I found my place with the more, sociable kids. But that curiosity always stuck with me. And when I got to undergrad, I started studying psychology at first because I thought I was interested in, the behavior. Like, why are we all different in this way, in this social way? And then, very long story short, I ended up having a horrifying nightmare that transformed my entire life. And that nightmare basically showed me that it wasn't the behavior I was curious about. It was the brain. I was interested in the brain itself. And what the nightmare basically revealed to me was that I was intimidated by neuroscience. I thought it was something I couldn't learn, and that I would, I'd fail the classes and I would fail out of school and everything would fall apart. But I was deeply interested in it. And the nightmare kind of pushed me over that edge where it was like, I cannot ignore this anymore. I have to study this. And so I transitioned into neuroscience and did my PhD in neuroscience, studying the neurobiology of autism. And so I got to sort of start to explore this question of, social differences in the brain. Where do they come from? Where do they live in the brain? And I, was living the dream, right? I was finally doing what I had always wanted to do. I overcame the classes. I had, had sort of achieved my dream. And then I have continued to move on. I went to Stanford and did my postdoc there, which is another step. It's kind of like a residency for a doctor, but the equivalent for a scientist. And while I was there, I worked on studying empathy, and specifically studying the neural basis of empathy, and how the drug MDMA, also known as ecstasy or Molly, how that turns up empathy in the brain. Like, what systems in the brain is that hitting on to make us more empathic? And the reason that I answered or studied that question isn't necessarily because I'm interested in Molly, although it is an interesting question, but it's more the deeper question is, very few drugs can make people more empathic. This one does. How is it doing it? If we can understand the systems in the brain that can be sort of ramped up to increase our empathy, that could be a powerful tool. So that's sort of how I got here, and the research that I've done to this point. But I've also done, I have some theories on virtual interactions, digital interactions, and how they affect our brains. And I've got a lot of thoughts about this space for sure.
I'm interested in what you found in your research when it comes to MDMA and empathy. So I grew up in a time of, I dabbled a lot with that, let's just say, right? Like I grew up in Chicago when we were in the rave scene, when the rave scene was like beginning, and that was the big drug on the street, right? So I dabbled in it quite a few times in my youth, and I will say I had a lot of great times. But as I got more into the clinical sides of things and got older, I started to notice a lot of research that was showing the links between MDMA and how it can help with trauma. So I was in the Marine Corps. I worked with the Veteran Administration, working with vets for a long time. So seeing the link with like how PTSD can affect empathy, for me, it's a very curious platform, because we still see a lot of stigma on drug usage and Molly usage. So from a clinical scientific standpoint, what did you learn that most surprised you when it came to drugs like MDMA, psychedelics even, and empathy in the brain?
Yeah, well, okay. I was at Stanford a couple of years ago. I still work there, but I no longer do research myself. But so picture, this is 2023. I'm at Stanford University. I am doing neuroscience research at, in one of the highest level labs you can work in as a neuroscientist. And what absolutely surprised me is that everybody that I would work with professionally, all the neuroscientists at Stanford, they all pretty much unanimously agreed that psychedelics were immensely therapeutic. And that shocked me, because when you talk to somebody outside of research, you talk to an average person, especially someone who's, a little older, maybe someone 40 plus, let's say 50 plus, they're going to say drugs, they put holes in your brain, MDMA, all this stuff, LSD, it's going to make you can crack your back, and you're going to flash back into tripping on acid. And there's all this, I don't know, I hate to say it, like propaganda, because it kind of is. Like, there's a lot of misinformation out there about these psychedelic drugs and MDMA and ketamine and all these drugs that are now being re-explored for their like legitimate clinical uses. And they hadn't been explored like that in the past, because as soon as it was discovered that these drugs have intensely powerful like psychoactive effects, they went into Schedule 1 classification. They are illegal, and not for no reason. Like, let's be clear, MDMA is not a drug you want to be taking every day. MDMA stands for 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It's very close to meth chemically, and so it's a stimulant. It can have really adverse effects. It can elevate your heart rate. You could there's bad things that can happen when you take Molly. And so it's not something that we want to be like giving out as prescriptions like we take SSRIs or Ritalin, right? So, however, all these psychedelic drugs have a really unique property in that they trigger these like life-altering experiences, right? Like when you take your SSRI every day, you're not like, oh my God, I'm tripping, and this is like, I'm changing how I see the world, right? Like, that's doing this very quiet, subtle change to your neurochemistry in the background that's maybe helping your mood. But with psychedelics, you are having a profound experience, and that experience seems to be really important for the therapeutic effects, specifically when paired with psychotherapy. That's also the key here. Like, when we're talking about MDMA and its use for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, someone like a veteran suffering from PTSD cannot take MDMA and go to Coachella, and just because the drug is flowing through their brain and their veins, that they're going to have some relief of their PTSD. That's not how it works. It's not that the drug is like tickling some system that regulates PTSD and just kind of turns it off in the brain. It's not like that. It's really the experience. It's that for PTSD specifically and MDMA makes everything euphoric. It kind of puts this like incredible like rose-colored glasses over everything. And so for someone with PTSD, if they're working with a therapist that they trust and they're able to go deep and do introspection and work their way into those traumatic memories that they're harboring and, affecting their daily life, usually that's a really difficult process because the memories are so intensely painful that they really can't access them and kind of work on them and change the way that they see them or kind of alter the memory. But with MDMA on board, suddenly that like horrifying, intense emotional feeling associated with the memory is kind of dropped because everything's euphoric, right? Even the worst thing you could possibly imagine is still not that bad. And so with the help of a therapist and doing therapy, like when these clinical trials are done with psychedelics, the people are, they're spending a lot of time with eye masks on, listening to music and like just experiencing it. But they're also spending a lot of time talking to a therapist that they know beforehand. And they do many sessions beforehand with the therapist. And so that's I think what a lot of people don't understand. And frankly, something I didn't understand either. Coming into the field, I was equally skeptical, especially like scientifically. Whenever there's a new idea, it's like, frankly, that's probably bullshit, right? Like whenever something new jumps on the scene, it's like, this probably isn't going to be validated. It's going to, it's one study. It seems interesting, but it's not going to pan out. But with psychedelics, like it's panning out. There are a ton of studies. And I should also note, very important to note, that it's not, I don't mean to suggest that like shrooms is helpful for PTSD and depression. I think when I talk about the therapeutic benefits of these drugs, people tend to think like, oh, they're just therapeutic. That's not how it is. They each drug seems to have specific conditions that it's useful for. And for MDMA, it happens to be PTSD. For psilocybin, it seems to be depression. Ketamine, also helpful for depression. Psilocybin, that's psychedelic mushrooms. That's the one where it's been kind of tested for a lot of different things. And from my understanding, I think depression is the biggest one. But, it's not that any of these drugs can heal any condition, but they're tested very well. And the data are very strong. That's the other thing. It's like when looking at the effects of these trials, the remission rates, the sort of how many people were healed is much higher than our traditional psychiatric approaches. Like ketamine for depression, it seems to be much more powerful than SSRIs. So there's, it's a misunderstood field, unfortunately, and there's actually a lot of promise.
What's interesting to me is that the research is showing not just the effectiveness on it, temporarily, but it seems to actually, so if I'm understanding this correctly, there's something neurochemically that's restructuring the way that some of these memories are processed, right? Because like when I think about things like EMDR, right? And for those that are listening, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. The concept behind it is that we're reprocessing things in a way that the brain doesn't store as something so traumatic. So what is actually happening in the brain when it comes to something like MDMA and the way that we perceive empathy? Is it like neuroplasticity where new learning is happening, or is it just something with our nervous system that is changing with that?
Yeah, there's two questions that I want to separate. So I want to take empathy out of the conversation for a moment, and we can come to that in a second because that's different. But when we're talking about like ketamine for depression, okay, other things than empathy is what I'm getting at. The sort of unifying factor of all psychedelics, not MDMA included, sorry. So this is really complicated neurochemistry and stuff. But when we're talking about like mushrooms, LSD, DMT, ketamine, which those drugs work differently in the brain, but what they all have in common is that they drive neuroplasticity, which is, as impossible as this may be to imagine. In your brain, all of your memories and your beliefs, and let's talk about memories specifically. It's thought that your memories are literally just sort of patterns of neurons interacting with each other at the same time at specific locations. So you have 86 billion neurons. This is where it gets like really incomprehensible and like impossible to envision, but try it. 86 billion cells in your brain. Each of them has, let's say 1,000 or more, but let's say 1,000 on average connections with other cells. So you have this extremely complicated, just like massive computer in your head, right? And if out of those 86 billion neurons and those 1,000 synapses, so there's like 86 trillion synapses, let's say. Maybe that's not even correct. I think that's correct. As for like the math I just did there, let's say there's like 40 of them that at random places in your brain, but there's 40 synapses that when those 40 synapses get activated at the exact same time, it's a memory. It is your brain is activating the parts that were activated when it experienced a certain thing, or that makes you think of a certain thing. So it might be like, if it's a memory of you like in a hot air balloon, right? There's some part of your brain that has like a distant memory of like the temperature and the feeling of the sensation of being in the hot air balloon and the heat from above you and the view, right? Somewhere in your visual cortex or something like that, right? So you have this like, you have this whole representation of like these ideas in your brain that are physical structures. And so what neuroplasticity is a shifting, a changing of those physical structures. And so that's what psychedelics do, is they can take the brain and like temporarily make it really flexible so that things can change. And so you can imagine if you have a traumatic memory and you go into a therapy session and you work with your therapist and you start to sort of think differently about that memory. And then you're therefore from there on out, when you re-access the memory, you access this sort of new interpretation you have of it. That requires your brain to physically change. It requires the synapses to physically change a bit. And now I'm not talking like, this isn't like your brain is like visibly changing. These are like tiny micro molecule changes that like would never be visible with even a brain scanner, but it's happening in there. So if you introduce psychedelics and you introduce all this plasticity, it's sort of like, I use this analogy of like, have you ever had a hat that doesn't really fit right? So you hit it with a hair dryer and you heat it up and it gets really warm and then you put it on your head and it starts to like cool and then it fits differently and it fits around your head, right? You like made it temporarily more flexible to change how you wanted it to. That's sort of how psychedelics affect the brain. It's like it's putting the hair dryer on the brain, making it really flexible. And in that period, while it's super flexible, if you have a really beneficial therapeutic session with the therapist, it can sort of restructure those memories in a way that's beneficial, at least more healthy than they were before. And then when your brain cools down, not literally, but starts to come back to its normal levels of plasticity and the drug wears off, you've now successfully reshaped that's those structures in your brain that hold those memories, and you may have permanent effects. So it's unlike any other drug, right? There's no other drug that does this. But the thing about MDMA, so sorry, I don't know if you wanted to get this deep into all like the neurobiology
I love it.
of it.
Let's do it.
Good. Okay. I feel bad for there's probably some people listening that are like, oh, this guy is horrible.
No, if my boyfriend listens to this, he's going to love it because he is like all for psychedelics. So yeah, let's do it.
Good. Okay. So MDMA is different because it's not all about plasticity. What MDMA does, scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like I'm a textbook giving you extremely detailed knowledge, like specifics, 1 being very little detail. What level of detail would you like me to explain this in? Just so I don't want to upset your listeners.
Let's explain for those that are listening that this is their first time kind of hearing the connections between MDMA, mental health. Maybe explain it to where a high schooler could understand what that means.
Okay. So what MDMA does in the brain, we know how it acts as a drug. We know the systems in the brain that it acts on. And there's 3 of them. There's 3 neurotransmitters, or these chemicals in the brain that it acts on, and it increases the levels of all 3 of them. Those 3 are serotonin, dopamine, and another one called norepinephrine or noradrenaline. But it acts primarily on serotonin and dopamine. Probably most people have heard of, let's just focus on those 2, right? Most people have probably heard of serotonin and dopamine. Serotonin's often thought of as being related to mood. Dopamine is often thought of as being related to motivation. And those things are both true. Of course, they do other things in the brain too. But there's research that has shown going into my research, that there's something about that serotonin, that driving increased serotonin, somehow it increases sociability. And this research comes from animal studies, actually. Like if you give a mouse MDMA, which interestingly, if you give a mouse MDMA, they respond very similarly to how humans do. They start spending more time together. They become more social. And there's molecular like studies that we could never, like we wouldn't be able to access the brain this way in humans that have been done in mice, that have figured out that that increased desire to hang out with each other, that increased sociability that MDMA creates, is because of serotonin release specifically, and specifically in a brain area called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is it's a sort of integrator for decision making. It takes in a lot of inputs from a lot of different brain areas and kind of tries to figure out like what's the value, what's the reward value of these various things I could do, and you think about like you got a plate of food in front of you and you have some vegetables and you have some potatoes and you have a steak and then you have like a soda, right? And the first thing your nucleus accumbens is helping you do is like you're assessing these options and you're like, oh, I'm starving right now. This steak looks so good. I'm going to go for the steak, right? I'm going to start there. And so it's taking in the value of all these options and motivating your decisions. And so it seems like for some reason, serotonin coming into that brain area motivates us to spend time with others. It's social. It's pro-social. And what's really interesting is that through my research, I was able to find that the what we would call empathogenic effects, empathy. So it's MDMA is an empathogen. It's this word means that it increases empathy. So those empathogenic or empathy increasing properties of MDMA were also related to this exact same signal. So if we took MDMA out of the equation and we just stimulated serotonin release in this brain area, the nucleus accumbens, it could increase empathy in the mice. And yes, we can measure empathy in mice. So it seems that one thing that MDMA is doing, among all these other things it's doing in the brain and body, is critical for driving both the pro-social and the empathogenic effect. This serotonin has something to do with, it seems like all or many of the social benefits of MDMA, including empathy. And the reason that matters is because, I mentioned that MDMA is a stimulant. It's similar to methamphetamine. And so the reason it's similar to methamphetamine is because it stimulates dopamine. When you stimulate dopamine, it's a stimulant, right? Dopamine is this like reward and motivation. It's, when you have more dopamine, you're increasing more dopamine in your brain. It's kind of keeping your brain active and searching for rewards and following up on things, hunting after rewards. And when you stimulate too much dopamine, it is literally just a stimulant. That's what methamphetamine does. It targets dopamine. So if we could take that out of the equation and we could just target serotonin the way that MDMA does, but without hitting all that other stuff, maybe we could create a drug that increases empathy without having, and not only empathy, but increases like the social connection without having all these other effects. And maybe that could be sufficient for helping those with PTSD without all these other harmful side effects of, basically giving them a stimulant that could be really detrimental to their health.
So what does that teach us about empathy in the brain in terms of, and I think where I'm getting at this is are there people who are just born more empathetic and have that empathy type of characteristic? And why are some people, and I'm not even talking about trauma and environment, but are there some people that just have more empathy? And if so, why? Is it genetic? Are we seeing anything else with the research based off of your research with empathy in the brain?
Yeah, there's a spectrum of empathy, and almost all traits, whether that's what you might want to call intelligence or athleticism or, how funny you are, right? Like you can think about all these things on a spectrum or a continuum where we all land somewhere on any of these things. And actually, this is kind of what intrigued me about my elementary school cafeteria. I noticed that everyone sort of landed somewhere on this continuum of being really quiet to really, really outgoing. Empathy is no different. We all fall within this range, right? But it's sort of a preset range, loosely, right? We all have there are people who don't have empathy, and that's generally, psychopathy is a condition characterized by an absence of empathy. That can be genetic. So certain genetic changes can sort of shift the way the brain functions in a way that basically prohibits empathy. But for those not diagnosed with psychopathy, we all sort of exist within this range. And we really don't have any clue about like why. As far as like neuroscience, right, is like if you put someone really empathic in a brain scanner and you put someone less empathic in a brain scanner, like what's really going on? I mean, what it would probably come down to is that the brain areas associated with empathy, which, by the way, so I fear this is getting really confusing, but the nucleus accumbens is actually not one of them. It's not a brain area that's traditionally thought to be associated with empathy. The brain areas that are thought to drive empathy are actually in the outer layer of the brain, the cortex, and they're called the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex. So, and basically what I'm saying here is, if you put people in a brain scanner and you show them some image or some video that would make them feel empathy, for example, an image of something painful, someone experiencing something painful, right? We are wired to empathize with others' pain. And so, what will happen is people will report, wow, I feel uncomfortable, right? Like, we can do this exercise right now. Imagine watching someone slam their fingers in a car door, right? Like the thud of the fingers, like getting trapped in the car door. I mean, horrible, right? Like you just grimaced, right? Mm-hmm. It feels bad. It feels bad to imagine this type of thing. And that's because these empathy related brain areas are turning on. And what's most amazing about all of this is because those empathy related brain areas that I just mentioned are also associated with experiencing pain ourselves. So when we view someone else's pain, we actually, like, our brain state mimics pain itself, but it's not the physical pain that we're experiencing. It's the emotional component of pain. So that feeling that you just had thinking about someone, slamming their fingers in the car door, your fingers don't actually hurt, right? There's no pain in your fingers. You might feel like a sort of special attention to your fingers, right? Like you might start thinking about the sensation in your fingers, but really what it just feels like is just this kind of like, ugh, get me away from this concept, right? And we all experience that same feeling when we experience pain ourselves, right? The pain hurts, the fingers hurt, but we also feel this like, dear God, make it stop, right? Like, give me some painkillers ASAP. This is horrible. And that's the emotional component of pain. And so that's where the overlap seems to be, that when we observe the pain, we show activity in those same brain areas. So anyways, going back all the way back to the question, if we were to put 1,000 people in a brain scanner and do the exact same thing, we would probably see a spectrum, in terms of the level of activity in those brain areas, because we all exist on a different sort of level in this. And the level that we are at seems to be largely determined by our experiences, actually, more so than our genetics. And so the way that I kind of see that working is that, our genes are so that are in a way that we have the capacity for empathy, right? We are all born with brains that can learn empathy. Our genes, if they are shifted all the way to one end, can kind of prevent our brains from experiencing empathy, or they can also sort of modulate how much empathy we feel. Maybe, there are certain genetic changes that are linked to like more empathy. But largely, I think that a lot of the empathy level we experience comes down to our life experience and like the way we were parented, the level of empathy our parents demonstrated for us. And there's evidence on this that basically our experiences are largely what shape our empathy. So when we put those 1,000 people in a brain scanner, hypothetically, and measure their empathy, it wouldn't necessarily come down to like, oh, this or that. It's like they each lived a unique life that at some point or another taught them about what other people's emotions mean. And in doing that, in learning that, their brain developed and grew and understood better how others express emotions and in turn became better at sensing and sharing other people's emotions, which is what empathy is.
That's very interesting. So it's really more of a spectrum, and bottom line, our environments really can shape how we perceive and even maybe portray empathy. And one thing when I was doing research on how to do this interview and some of the work that you've done, a lot of the stuff that you've done with like brain and social behaviors are fascinating to me. And I'm curious from like more of an evolutionary perspective, do you feel that our brains are wired for social connection? And if so, why?
Oh yeah, 100%. There's no doubt about it, in fact. And on top of that, we're not the only ones, right? Every species on Earth, animal species, can be classified as either social or solitary. And the main distinction is social animals, including humans and, primates, monkeys, and like mice, rodents, right? They all exist. They all survive best in groups. Humans survive really, really well in groups. We have all these features that are pretty amazing. In fact, humans have some special features that allow us to work really well together in groups. Like one of my favorite examples is like the whites of the eyes. They're called sclera. If you look at another animal, the space around their eye is not white. Most of them are dark. That white sclera actually makes it easier for us to tell where we're looking, right? Like you can tell right now, I'm looking here, and now I just moved my eyes, or listeners can't see, but so, you can tell where someone's looking, and that gives you a window into their brain, right? You can tell a little bit about what they're thinking. So like, for example, if you and I were working together to fight a wolf that just invaded our camp, and you look at me and I glance at the wolf's foot and then look back at you and kind of nod, you would say, oh, something about the foot. You'd look at the foot and the foot's bleeding. And I'm trying to point out to you, hey, look, there's a weak spot that we can attack, right? Like we can literally read each other's minds. It's unbelievable. We take this for granted completely. Other animals don't do that as well. Like chimpanzees can't read each other's eyes as well because they have dark sclera. So we, at some point, long time ago, we faced a challenging world that basically was threatening our survival in all ways, food scarcity and predators and all, inclement weather. And when these challenges hit us, the ones who were most likely to survive were the ones that were in groups. And so humans were incentivized to be together. And so the best way for this to kind of work in perpetuity is if we actually feel a desire to be around each other, if we actually feel good around each other. And so what that looks like in the brain, and why I not only believe, but I know we are wired for connection, is we have social reward systems. So there are systems in our brain that make us feel good when we're around each other. And by the way, that's a 3-part system. Oxytocin, which we all know is the love hormone. We've surely heard of it. But the other 2 neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine, the same 2 neurotransmitters that MDMA acts on to enhance empathy and enhance sociability and also make us feel euphoric. So the fact that being around others triggers the same brain activity as ecstasy says a lot about, why we are wired to be social, right? We are made so that we feel good around others. And when we're apart from others, we actually experience stress. Being socially isolated is a form of stress. And when people are isolated, the stress hormone cortisol starts to go up. And when they are reunited with others, cortisol goes down. On the other hand, solitary animals, those that survive better on their own, an example of this is like tigers, right? Tigers, they don't need to be in groups. They're super effective hunters. If they were to exist in groups, they would just be, competing for resources all the time. So it's actually better for them to exist individually. Solitary animals like that show the exact opposite. So they actually show increased cortisol levels when they are forced to live together. So their brains are wired accordingly to permit them to naturally seek out the lifestyle that is best for their survival. And humans are just the same. We are literally yes, nowadays it's different. Obviously, we have, I am standing inside of a temperature controlled room right now, and I don't necessarily need other humans to survive. But my brain still thinks it's like a million years ago. We still have the same hardware that our ancient ancestors did in our heads. And this brain and your brain is built for a world where we need each other to survive. And so because of that, when we fail to find connection and we allow ourselves to become isolated, our health actually suffers because we're dealing with basically chronic stress, and we're missing out on this upside of socializing, because when we're around others, our body basically rewards us with all sorts of health benefits to basically say, look, you're doing the right thing. Here are the benefits. You're going to be healthier. You're going to be, less inflammation. It's neuroprotective. There's all sorts of benefits to socializing, not to mention a better mood. So, you mentioned my book at the beginning. The reason I wrote that book, which ties in directly to this topic, is because I don't think that people really understand the significance there. And as a, researcher in this field who's been studying this for a decade, I obviously view the world through this very like thick lens of neuroscience, that I see how our lives are changing and the way we're spending time online instead of in person, and all these different ways that society and culture is changing. And I don't think it's healthy. And but the reason that irks me the most is because I don't think that the general public has had the access to the science to share my understanding of why this matters. And so my goal with my book was to really like make it all very clear. Like the first page of my book is a no big words clause. Like it's science, but it's extremely clear. It's really written for anybody at the high school level to understand. And I'm really hoping that it'll change the way people think about their social lives from now on.
It's interesting what you said, and I'm sure you've heard of the blue zones, right? There are these, for those that are listening that haven't heard of it, it's these areas in the world that they have the most amount of people that are living over the age of 100. And they research these areas. What is it about these specific areas in the world? Why are they living so much longer? And one of the top things that they saw with the research was social interaction and experiences, social connections. A lot of these areas, there is social connections. I know the barista down the street. I know my neighbor. I have lunch with my friends every Sunday, and I see my family every Saturday. You know, there was these groups of people that had tons of social interactions, and that was correlating to the longevity of life in these areas. Now, you talked about how our current society, and I think we saw after COVID, right? COVID changed everything. We went from, technology, but a social community to 100% virtual, and everything changed, right? And now we even see jobs that are still working from home. People like to work from home. Isolation became more comfortable. We became so connected technologically, but so disconnected socially. And my daughter, she's almost 17 in 2 weeks, and she's lived in an era of nothing but technology. And I'm wondering, based off of your research, what you've learned, what you've seen, what is happening, do you think, in the brain when we are in this society of just being more isolated? Is anything changing? Are we seeing anything from a scientific perspective?
Yeah. So it's basically impossible to answer this question scientifically, to look at like what are the effects of the digital era, right? Because there's no control group. David Eagleman, neuroscientist, talks about this a lot, that, we don't have a control group because phones are everywhere. And the only control groups we could find that haven't been affected by phone use would be like super remote cultures that are so distinct from the cultures we exist in that they can't even be compared with. And so, the way that I tend to look at this question is like, what are the net effects of interacting online digitally versus in person? And there are studies on this that basically what they show, unfortunately, but kind of predictably, is that people don't benefit as much from interacting online. When you look at the mood benefits of a social interaction, which I mentioned before, we have social reward brain systems. We feel good after interacting. That is proven time and time again. That doesn't really happen quite as strongly when we interact online. And it specifically seems like the less lifelike the interactions are. So, for example, a text interaction is even less lifelike than a video interaction, the worse the benefits are. So the texting is like hardly any benefit, whereas a video call is a little bit better. Although texting is still better than having no social contact at all. And so from the neuroscience angle, the way that I make sense of this is, our brains are designed to detect all of these social cues, and like just thinking about like the sclera of the eyes, right? Like that one thing, that's one tiny signal that you've probably never even thought about before that your brain is processing at all times. Add onto that, the tone of voice that someone's using, their facial expressions, the appearance of their, skin, their hair, like all like their body language. There's just so much, not to mention what they're actually saying to you. But there's so much information for the brain to take in that informs us and tells your brain, this is a human being you're interacting with. But when you go into let's say a phone call, and you're taking away so much of those cues, you're taking away eye contact, you're taking away the smells, any social smells, you're taking away body language, you're taking away facial expressions. There's just less texture for the brain to absorb and to process. And so it makes sense that while the brain understands, this is a human on the other end of the phone that I'm talking to, it's not being engaged in quite the same way. And so it makes sense to me that those social reward brain systems that usually get fired up when we interact, they have sort of less reason to. Just like there's not as much information they're telling you this is an interaction you're having. And I think we can all kind of relate to this. I mean, how often do you get off the phone with someone and you're like, wow, that was just like such a refresher. I mean, sometimes it happens, it does, but much less often than you get out of, you leave a friend's house after hanging out for a couple hours and you're like, wow, I actually feel a lot better. Like that almost always happens. Usually when people interact, they feel better, unless it was like there was something toxic about the interaction or something bad happening. Obviously that's not good. But like usually when you go to the party or you go meet friends for dinner, or you do whatever that you thought about canceling on at the last minute, you feel better. But, it's not like you're texting a friend throughout the day and you're like, wow, I feel so good. I don't know. Maybe I'm biased because of, I don't really love using my phone, but the research suggests that is the case.
Well, it makes sense to me because I think about me and my partner, we're long distance. And so, listen, not to put our shit out there, but the only time we've ever had like any type of argument has been on the phone, never in person, right? So It makes me think about how it is so much different in person because you're seeing body language, there's physical touch, there is the things that you're seeing with the sclera in the eyes and tones of voice. You're getting so much more language and data when you're in person versus when you're on the phone. So I think it's interesting to see how technology is going to both benefit us and maybe even hurt our social connections in the long run. But it brings me to... Yeah,
can I add to that? Sorry, because we are on Diary of an Empath, it's important to close that subject by saying, I think empathy is particularly affected in virtual interactions. I published a paper on this a couple of years ago where I proposed this theory. I call it the virtual disengagement hypothesis, proposing the idea that in virtual interactions, the empathy areas in our brains disengage because there's a ton of research showing that what tells those empathy areas to turn on? Well, it's social cues, it's facial expressions, it's tone of voice, right? And you can just think about like the difference between how it would feel if someone walked past you, smiling and singing the music in their ears, right, on the sidewalk, versus if they sprinted past you and their face is horrified and they're screaming, right? Like that has a dramatically different impact on your brain and the way you feel. And that's because of empathy. That's because those signals are telling your brain those are important emotions to pay attention to. But when we interact online, even on a phone call, and we don't have those cues, it makes perfect sense that those brain areas would not turn on as much. And so when we're not experiencing as much empathy, when we're not as tuned in with the emotions that other people are feeling, we basically become careless. We become, we don't care as much about their feelings. We sort of disregard their emotions in the moment. And that's bad because when you're thinking about hurting someone's feelings, right, most of the time what stops you from being insulting to someone is because it hurts you to watch someone suffer. And so if you don't have to watch them suffer, if you can comment on someone's post and say, you look fat today, normally you would never say that to someone because they'd feel terrible and they'd start crying and you'd feel terrible. That's empathy. But when you don't have to be there and you don't have to experience empathy, because your brain's empathy areas are turned off because they don't perceive that this is a real human in front of you. It's just a text box on your phone. We can be more hostile. And I think this is actually underlying a lot of the hostility and the division that we see online nowadays. And it also explains why you and your partner would fight more long distance. And by the way, my wife and I, our first year of our relationship was long distance. It was horrible. We fought all the time. And then we moved in together and we like never fought again. It was like everything was perfect. It's like, how was this happening? Why is that the way? Well, it could be because, when you're in an argument and you see that the person you care about is on the verge of tears, you start to feel bad and you relent, right? You calm down. You're like, all right, you know what? I'm hurting their feelings. I feel bad now. Let me tone it down. But that doesn't happen on a phone call as much because there's just less information for your brain to turn that on. So I actually plan to study some of that myself in the next few years, looking at empathy online and see if we can validate some of these theories I have in a brain scanner.
That's very interesting, and you brought up a good point too, because I think there's also a added layer of being anonymous that kind of adds to there's got to be something happening in the brain when when there's a lack of empathy because you're not seeing the person, you're missing a lot of body language, a lot of cues. But then there's this level of feeling anonymous or being anonymous, that we see things that are being said and done online that are almost like how inhumane, right? How can you say that to someone? You would never say that to someone's face. And I'm curious, is there anything within the research that adds another layer or level with being anonymous and lacking empathy? Have you seen anything with that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Totally. There's up until I published this theory that I just mentioned, there were a lot of other theories out there about why we're so mean online, because there's no doubt people are horrible to each other online. None of them had involved any neuroscience until my theory, but they did. A lot of them involved anonymity. And there's no question about it. The fact that you are anonymous online is a major incentive to do wrong to others, right? There's no risk of you damaging your own reputation because your reputation is private, right? So no doubt about it, that's a factor. And I do sort of think that factors into the empathy a little bit, and that it allows people to sort of disengage, right? I think that when you see someone suffering and you don't act in person, in real life, there's sort of a guilt, it's like, even if you don't feel empathy, it's like, man, I really don't feel anything, but like, don't I look kind of bad if I don't do something, right? Like, someone falls on their bike next to you and you're like, I don't know this person, like, I'm kind of embarrassed for them. Or like, doesn't it look bad if I just keep on walking, right? Like, but imagine if you were like fully like masked up and it was the middle of winter and nobody could see your identity, and you're like, oh, you know what? Like, nobody can tell who I am. Like, I'm just going to keep on moving. That's pretty much what's going on social media, right? I think that the anonymity may not factor in directly to the empathy, but I think it's sort of like a secondary component that allows us to like forgive ourselves for not being considerate.
Unless you're like in New York City, that seems to be the norm.
Right. Yeah. That's also, that's a good point too. Yeah. It's like you're sort of lost in the sea of people on the streets.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wrote down shame and rejection, and it kind of ties into guilt, right? Like in our caveman days, if I stole your caveman meat, I'm going to be rejected from the tribe, right? And then I can die, right? So it kind of goes in with that social interaction of we're hardwired to not want to feel rejection, shame, guilt, right? It's not supposed to be something that we feel good to feel, because that it can mean life or death back in our caveman days. It's in our DNA. But it seems like with online interactions, that piece of it seems to be missing. And I wonder if there's correlation to the empathy piece of it too. When you think about your legacy and what you want to leave the audience with, in terms of if you could leave one message about why their brain needs friends and social interaction, what would that message be?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think the data are very clear that we are becoming more isolated, right? We've all heard about like this loneliness, epidemic of loneliness, right? And probably you've heard the number like, oh, like being socially isolated is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Like that statistic gets thrown around a lot. It's real. Like being socially isolated increases the risk for Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes. It can reduce our pain tolerance. It can increase the risk of suicide. It can increase anxiety, depression. It's not good for us. Also in older people, which I think are really an important population, being isolated not only, increases the risk of death in those above 65, being isolated increases the risk of death by 78% in men and 57% in women. By the way, in the general population, it's 50%. I'm sounding like a textbook right now. This is a lot of numbers, but the reason I'm sharing all of this is because I don't think people understand that it actually does matter. And that the analogy I like to use for this is, imagine if like the Earth shifted on its axis and the sun in the sky changed so that now the sun is actually up for an additional like 8 hours. And by the way, I don't even know if this makes sense, if like if this even like makes sense like in this space cosmology. But so let's just say that happened. And we, instead of having 8 hours of sleep, we started having like 4 hours of sleep collectively as a species. I think that people would start ringing the alarms because we would all start going about our days and be like, wow, I feel terrible. And this is like obviously related to the sleep, because people generally understand that it's important to get a certain amount of sleep. But I think that if that were to happen with socializing, I'm not sure people would be ringing the alarms, because I don't think people truly understand the significance of it and the way that it affects our biology, the same way that they understand sleep or exercise or diet, those things as being like fundamental pillars of health. But the reality is sleep or socializing is one of those things. And that is actually exactly what's happening, that we have shown this very strong decline in social interaction. And all of a sudden you look around the world and it's like, why is everybody so anxious? Why is everybody so depressed? Why is everybody panicking all the time? Like, why do I feel so like extra sensitive to the news cycle? Like, why am I stuck scrolling on my phone? I'm not saying that socializing is like the remedy for all of this, but it definitely has a substantial impact. And you can imagine how if you were permitted to get 2 more hours of sleep every night, what that would do for your health and wellness. If you were just to build in a little bit more social interaction in your life, I think you might see similar benefits. And so I genuinely, I really hope people take this seriously. I'm not trying to like sound the alarms and freak people out. It's really just that like I want to spread awareness about that this actually matters. And so please go spend time with your friends and family. It makes a difference.
I love that. Well, Dr. Rein, thank you for your work in this field. You're clearly passionate about what you do, and it's important that we, have more social interaction and that we have conversations like this. And your book is out for pre-order now, right? So we're going to link it below. Make sure you guys grab a copy. Why Your Brain Needs Friends. And when's the date that it'll be officially released?
October 14th.
Okay, perfect. So available for pre-order now, and get a copy of it. Spend time with your friends and family. Dr. Rein, thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.